Look, I'm a stress eater. You may be too. But I'm also an actor. If I'm scared or nervous, like addressing you this morning, I prefer not to eat anything. The butterflies in my stomach like room to flutter by. But in those times when I'm sad, lonely, lost, guilty, overwhelmed, or alone, those times when I'm stuck in hours of traffic in Delaware, of all places, I like to eat. Maybe that's why I can be so easily emotionally manipulated by reality cooking shows. Food and emotion, they go together, and they go together in our guts. That's why I stress eat salty food. I want the distraction of a feast that makes me thirsty for more. At first, my goal was to stay really light and airy with the bread of life, the brioche model, because it invites silly reflection on the sacraments and theological puns. What a title! Bread God. And cue more flowery puns, and that's flour spelled F-L-O-U-R for those paying attention at home. But exploring the bread of life feels very different in light of our first lesson today. The story of a battle in the woods that ends in both victory and tears. We get to overhear King David experiencing a suffering that's too horribly easy to imagine. The loss of his son, beaten to death while hanging from a tree between heaven and earth. I've been thinking about what it means to hear someone else's weeping. I've been thinking about how it feels to listen to someone else who cries like King David, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, my son." In those moments, I never know what to say. What could anyone say when someone else's world starts to crumble before our eyes? And so, I spend a lot of time reading theology. In theory, that's what a young theologian's supposed to do. Eat through books written by people smarter than me, drink in interpretations by those wiser than me. My temptation, perhaps this is yours too, is to seek after some foothold in the mystery, something to grasp onto that makes sense. Humans cannot see the face of God and live. That much I learned from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you should know that Indiana Jones has a phenomenally orthodox doctrine of God. I like that idea, though, that if we get to enjoy the bread of heaven in heaven and see God face to face, it might be like that big seminar on theology in the sky that Dante describes in the Paradiso. The promise of a mystery that's so exciting, even when you figure it all out, there's still more to talk about. But do we ever really see God face to bread? Jesus explains something rather perplexing in today's gospel. Jesus says, "Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God, i.e. me. He has seen the Father. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life, and I am the bread of life." All right, this raises a few questions for me. The first, we've shifted from an image of hearing and learning to one of seeing. Two, we know that we can only see by going to Christ. And three, there's then all this flesh-eating bread stuff. Cheeky questions, but they deserve serious answers. And today we heard the crescendo of the so-called bread of life discourse in St. John's Gospel. Here, Jesus tells us something particular about who God is by sharing with us resonances of another time God told us who God is. There are a couple of resonances to the Exodus story in today's Gospel. That's the Passover story, where Moses leads God's chosen people out from captivity in Egypt to freedom. We heard a direct allusion from Christ, right? Your ancestors ate manna in the desert. God feeds God's people on their journey to what I like to call Old Canaan when I'm here, the Promised Land. But there's another, slightly more subtle and theologically crucial reference to Exodus. Did you catch it? Sometimes when this passage is printed, the phrase "I am" will be in all capital letters. Do you remember who said "I am" before? It was the phrase that was given to Moses by the burning bush, the name that God offers for God's self, Yahweh. I am who I am. The God who saves and who delivers the Hebrew people out of captivity is the God who reveals who God is in a consuming fire that never burns up. The bush burns with God's being, but it doesn't burn away. God's fire is very different from the ones raging on the West Coast. God's being can be seen in a fire that burns without loss.